Grace Kelly became the Princess of Monaco when she married Prince Rainier III, but was married life truly more luxurious than her former life in Hollywood? Here's why Grace Kelly's marriage was more complicated than you thought.
The Mediterranean sun sparkled off the chrome of the Rover P6, a flash of silver against the jagged cliffs of Monaco. But inside the cabin, the Princess of Grace wasn't looking at the view. She was looking back at a life built on a beautiful, gilded lie. What happens when the world's most photographed woman realizes she's playing a role she never auditioned for? Grace Kelly was the legendary ice queen of Hitchcock's dreams, the iconic face of 1,000 magazine covers, and the sovereign of a fairytale principality. Yet, beneath the Cartier diamonds and the silk scarves, an unresolved question lingered. Who did she truly belong to? Tonight, we peel back the velvet curtain of the Grimaldi dynasty to explore the famous whispers of a hidden devotion, a secret confession made just before the silence of the hairpin turn changed history forever. The Philadelphia debutante and the hidden spark. The story of Grace Kelly often begins with a crown, but the true prologue was written in the chilly, prestigious corridors of East Falls, Pennsylvania. To the public, she was the quintessential daughter of a self-made brickwork tycoon, a girl whose life was mapped out in the social registers of the main line. Her father, Jack Kelly, was a man of Olympic gold and iron will who viewed his daughter as a delicate asset to be managed. Within the high stone walls of the family mansion, Grace moved through a world of white gloves and strict etiquette. Yet those who knew her intimately caught glimpses of a woman who was deeply, quietly at odds with her environment. The atmosphere in that house was one of suffocating expectations. There was a restless energy in Grace during her teenage years, a sense that she was merely wearing a mask of the dutiful debutante while waiting for the real performance to begin. Visitors often spoke of a watchful presence in the home, the feeling that every move Grace made was being weighed against the Kelly family reputation. It was here, amidst the silver tea sets and the smell of floor wax, that she first experienced the heartbreak of a forbidden attraction. She fell for a man who did not fit the narrow mold of a Philadelphia gentleman, setting a pattern of seeking fire in a world that demanded ice. The tragic irony of her early life is that the very poise that made her a global icon was born from a need to hide her true feelings from a judgmental father. She was a woman who learned to speak in whispers because the roar of her family's ambition was too loud. Behind the legendary serenity lay the loneliness of a girl who realized that her heart was the only thing she truly owned, and even that was being bargained away for a seat at the table of high society. The heartbreaking choice. Oleg Cassini. By the time Grace Kelly met Oleg Cassini, she had already conquered the silver screen with a cold, untouchable brilliance. Yet, the man who dressed the most famous women in the world saw a fire in her that the cameras often missed. Their romance was not the calculated move of a rising star, but a collision of two souls who found solace in the quiet corners of New York's jazz clubs. Cassini was a man of immense charm and a storied past, a combination that made him the ultimate enigma to a woman raised in the rigid confines of Philadelphia high society. For the first time in her adult life, Grace felt the exhilarating weight of a love that was entirely her own, free from the expectations of her family or the scripts of a studio boss. The couple eventually entered into a secret engagement, a brief window of time where Grace imagined a future defined by fashion and freedom rather than titles and tradition. However, the atmosphere of their courtship was haunted by a watchful presence from the past. Her father, Jack Kelly, viewed Cassini as a flamboyant outsider who was entirely unworthy of the Kelly name. The pressure from her parents was relentless, a chilling force that began to erode the joy of the engagement. Grace found herself caught in a tragic irony. The more she loved Cassini, the more she was forced to realize that choosing him would mean a permanent exile from the family she still desperately sought to please. Ultimately, the heartbreak of their separation was a quiet internal collapse. Those close to her noted a restless energy in her movements after the breakup, as if she were mourning a life that had been snatched away just as it began to breathe. She traded the passionate uncertainty of a life with Cassini for the structured, hollow perfection of a Mediterranean throne. It was a sacrifice of the heart that left an indelible mark on her legacy, a reminder that even a princess can spend a lifetime wondering about the path she was forced to abandon. The Hitchcock years, a proxy for passion. Alfred Hitchcock was a man who possessed a singular, almost haunting obsession with the blonde archetype. But in Grace Kelly, he found a collaborator who transcended his wildest cinematic fantasies. During the height of the 1950s, their partnership became the gold standard of psychological thrillers, yet the air on their film sets often hummed with a restless energy that felt entirely personal. Hitchcock famously described Grace as a volcano covered in snow, a woman whose external poise masked a private intensity that he was determined to capture on celluloid. For Grace, these years were more than just a career peak. They were a sanctuary where she could explore the emotions that her rigid upbringing had forced her to bury. The incident of her Hollywood tenure was a series of intense, fleeting connections with her leading men, from Ray Milland to William Holden. These rumors were more than mere tabloid fodder. They represented a desperate search for the heat she had lost when her family dismantled her engagement to Oleg Cassini. On the sun-drenched sets of the French Riviera while filming To Catch a Thief, there was a chilling foreshadowing in the way she handled high-speed driving scenes. The watchful presence of the studio in the public eye meant that her private life remained a carefully guarded mystery, yet the tragic irony was that she was most alive when she was playing someone else. By the time she reached her final film, High Society, a sense of weariness had begun to settle over her. The sensory details of her life, the heavy velvet curtains of her trailers, the blinding flashbulbs of the paparazzi, and the constant smell of stage makeup began to feel like a gilded cage. She was a woman seeking a home in the eyes of her co-stars, an unfinished business of the soul that followed her across the Atlantic. When she finally left Hollywood for Monaco, she wasn't just leaving a career. She was leaving the only place where she was allowed to be a woman of passion. The wedding of the century, a silent coronation. In April 1956, the eyes of 30 million television viewers were fixed on the tiny principality of Monaco for an event the press labeled a fairy tale come to life. Grace Kelly arrived on the Constitution of the SS Constitution, greeted by a literal rain of red and white carnations dropped from a plane owned by Aristotle Onassis. To the outside world, this was the ultimate achievement for a Hollywood star. A transition from the fleeting fame of the screen to the eternal prestige of a royal bloodline. Yet behind the spectacle of the two separate ceremonies and the 1,000 guests, the atmosphere was thick with a chilling sense of finality. Grace was not just marrying a man, she was signing a contract that required the total surrender of her former identity. The incident of the wedding was the sheer physical and emotional exhaustion that plagued the bride. She later admitted that she disliked every moment of the week-long festivities, describing the experience as the most terrifying of her life. The sensory details of the St. Nicholas Cathedral were overwhelming, from the heavy scent of lilies that filled the air to the weight of the Brussels lace and silk taffeta gown that required dozens of seamstresses to complete. There was a watchful presence in the crowd as the world's cameras turned her into a silent monument. Every flashbulb served as a reminder that she was no longer a private citizen but a state asset, a symbol of hope for a struggling Mediterranean microstate. While the public celebrated her as a modern Cinderella, Grace found herself wandering through the cold, drafty corridors of a 200-room palace where she was viewed with suspicion by the local aristocracy. The restless energy that had fueled her career was suddenly stifled by the rigid protocols of the Grimaldi court. She spent her days learning French and navigating the complex etiquette of her new home, often retreating to her private quarters to find a moment of peace. The profound loneliness of a woman who had reached the pinnacle of global status, only to find that the view from the top was obscured by stone walls and ancient rules. She had traded the roar of the crowd for a crown that felt more like a heavy burden than a gift. The return to the stage, the gilded refusal. By the early 1960s, the initial luster of the royal wedding had faded into a demanding routine of ribbon cuttings and diplomatic galas. Grace Kelly felt a restless energy as she paced the marble floors of the prince's palace, a woman who had once commanded the attention of millions through her craft, now reduced to a silent figurehead. The incident that nearly altered the course of her life arrived in the form of a script from Alfred Hitchcock for a film titled Mourning. For a brief, exhilarating moment, Grace believed she could bridge her two worlds, returning to the screen to play a complex, troubled heroine while maintaining her duties as a sovereign. She saw the role as a lifeline, a way to reclaim the creative fire that had been dampened by years of palace protocol. However, the atmosphere in Monaco quickly turned from curious to hostile. The watchful presence of her subjects and the traditionalist court officials created a chilling barrier to her ambitions. To the people of the principality, a princess could not portray a thief or a woman with a fractured psyche on a cinema screen. The irony was that the very people who celebrated her as a movie star now viewed her former profession as a stain on the dignity of the Grimaldi line. The outcry was so profound that Prince Rainier was forced to intervene, ultimately leading to the heartbreaking announcement that Grace would not be returning to Hollywood. This rejection marked her middle years. She reportedly retreated into a deep, quiet grief, spending hours in her private gardens where the only sounds were the Mediterranean wind and the distant sea. The scent of damp earth and the cold touch of stone benches became her only company as she mourned the death of her artistic identity. She had become a prisoner of the very fairy tale she helped create, realizing that her crown was a permanent barrier between her and the work she truly loved. The secret tapes and late-night confessions. As the 1980s dawned, the image of the serene Princess Grace began to show subtle human cracks that only her most trusted confidants were permitted to see. The atmosphere within her private retreat at Rock Ogle was often thick with a restless energy, a stark contrast to the rigid formality of the palace in Monte Carlo. During this period, rumors began to surface of Grace engaging in deeply personal conversations that were captured on tape or recorded in the meticulous notes of close friends. These sessions were not the polished interviews of a global icon, but the raw outpourings of a woman who felt the heavy weight of unfinished business. She spoke with a chilling level of candor about the paths she had abandoned and the singular figures from her past who still occupied her thoughts. The incident at the center of these revelations was her increasing willingness to discuss the great mistake of her youth. In these hushed, late-night sessions, the smell of lavender from the gardens and the cold night air pressing against the windows seemed to amplify her sense of isolation. She described the tragic irony of living in a world of absolute luxury while feeling a profound spiritual poverty. There was a watchful presence in her voice, a fear that her true self would be entirely erased by the historical myth of the princess. She reportedly alluded to a man whose name stayed tucked away in the shadows of her heart, a love that existed long before the Mediterranean sun became her constant companion. These confessions suggest that beneath the diamonds and the diplomatic poise, Grace Kelly was a woman mourning a ghost. She was no longer content to be a silent statue in a royal gallery. She was a person desperately trying to reconcile the woman she was in Philadelphia and Hollywood with the sovereign she had become. The final descent, Route de la Turbie. On the morning of September 13, 1982, the sun rose over the Mediterranean with a clarity that seemed to mask the heavy atmosphere clinging to the mountain retreat of Rock Ogle. Princess Grace made a decision that struck her staff as unusual. She chose to drive herself back to the palace in Monaco. The vehicle was a 1971 Rover 3500, a car that was already a decade old and lacked the modern safety features that might have altered the course of history. Because the back seat was packed with dresses and hat boxes from her summer holiday, there was no room for a chauffeur. This left Grace and her teenage daughter Stephanie alone in the cabin as they began the descent toward the coast. The incident occurred on the D37, a treacherous stretch of road known as the Route de la Turbie. This serpentine path is carved directly into the limestone cliffs, offering breathtaking views of the sea alongside terrifying drops into the valley below. As the car approached a particularly sharp hairpin turn, it did not slow down. Instead, the silver Rover accelerated, crashing through the small stone barrier and plummeting 120 feet down the mountainside. The sensory details of the scene were hauntingly silent in the moments after the impact. There was no screech of brakes, only the sound of metal meeting the parched earth and the smell of gasoline mixing with the scent of wild thyme. A chilling realization emerged as investigators looked at the map of the crash site. This was the exact location where Grace had filmed one of her most famous scenes in To Catch a Thief nearly 30 years earlier. In the film, she had driven the same roads with a reckless, flirtatious energy, terrifying her co-star Cary Grant. The tragic irony of her life ending on the very stage where she once played a woman in total control of her destiny is a detail that has fueled decades of speculation. Some witnesses claim to see the car swerve as if a struggle were occurring inside, while medical reports later suggested she suffered a minor stroke that caused her to lose control of the brakes. As the wreckage was located, the watchful presence of the world's media began to descend. But inside the car, the princess was merely a mother trying to protect her child. She was found pinned behind the steering wheel, a woman who had spent her life navigating the narrowest of social and political paths, only to be undone by a literal road she could no longer manage. The restless energy that had defined her search for meaning was silenced on a slope overlooking the kingdom that had both exalted and confined her. The mystery of the unsent letter. In the chaotic aftermath of the crash at the Route de la Turbie, the focus of the world remained on the medical bulletins and the solemn preparations for a state funeral. However, a quieter story began to circulate among the inner circle of the palace and a few trusted associates in the United States. Rumors persisted that among the personal effects recovered from the wreckage, or perhaps tucked away in a private desk at the Roc Aguel retreat, was a letter that had never reached its destination. This document was allegedly addressed to a residence in New York City, the longtime home of Oleg Cassini. If such a letter existed, it represented a bridge spanning nearly 30 years of silence, a final attempt by a woman in the twilight of her life to reach back to the man who had seen her as a person rather than a princess. The atmosphere surrounding this discovery was one of intense, guarded secrecy. The Grimaldi family had spent decades meticulously crafting the image of a perfect royal union, and any evidence of a lingering, unresolved passion for an old Hollywood flame would have shattered the carefully maintained facade. There was a watchful presence in the way the palace archivists and security handled Grace's private correspondence in the days following her passing. They were tasked with preserving a legacy, but in doing so, they may have buried the most humanizing evidence of her true internal life. The sensory details of this hidden history are found in the hushed tones of former aides who spoke of a princess who often sat alone in the late hours. The scratch of a fountain pen against heavy stationery, the only sound in a room filled with the scent of old books and Mediterranean jasmine. The incident of the unsent letter suggests a tragic irony in the timing of her death. Grace had spent her life adhering to the rules of others, yet in her final months, there was a noticeable shift in her demeanor. She seemed to be searching for a way to reconcile her public duty with her private heart. Those who claim to have knowledge of the letter's contents describe a message filled with a chillingly beautiful nostalgia. It was not a plea for a new beginning, but a profound acknowledgement of a shared past. It was a confession that despite the crown and the children and the decades of royal service, a part of her had remained in those smoke-filled New York jazz clubs where she was simply Grace. Ultimately, the existence of such a letter remains a subject of elegant speculation. Whether the letter was destroyed to protect the monarchy or remains locked in a vault, its legend serves as a powerful reminder of the loneliness that often accompanies great status. Grace Kelly died with the world at her feet, but her heart may have been reaching across an ocean toward a man she was never allowed to keep. The prince's long mourning, the melancholy of Monaco. Following the interment of Princess Grace in the Grimaldi family vault, a heavy and chilling silence descended upon the Palace of Monaco. Prince Rainier III, once a man of vibrant energy and decisive leadership, appeared to the world as a figure of perpetual, frozen grief. The atmosphere of the court shifted from a bustling center of Mediterranean glamour to a place of somber reflection, where the watchful presence of Grace's memory felt more tangible than the living inhabitants. Rainier never remarried, a decision that transformed his remaining 23 years into a long, solitary vigil. He often spoke of her not as a sovereign who had fulfilled a role, but as the light that had suddenly been extinguished from his life, leaving the gilded rooms of his home feeling cold and hollow. The incident of his long mourning was marked by his obsession with preserving her image exactly as it had been. He kept her private rooms at the palace and at Roc Aguel untouched, as if expecting her to walk through the door at any moment. The sensory details of his daily existence were steeped in a tragic irony. He was surrounded by the immense wealth and beauty that she had helped build for his country, yet he lived in a state of profound emotional poverty. Visitors to the palace often noted the scent of her favorite roses still being brought into the halls, a fragrant reminder of a woman who was no longer there to enjoy them. Rainier had been the one to insist on the rigid protocols that had often stifled her spirit, and in her absence he became the primary guardian of her myth. He spent countless hours at her tomb in the Cathedral of Our Lady Immaculate, a man of immense power humbled by the realization that some losses are absolute. His life became a testament to the fact that while a crown can be passed down, the heart of a home cannot be replaced once it is gone. The legacy of the Ice Queen's fire. The enduring legacy of Grace Kelly is often presented as a static portrait of mid-century perfection, a collection of high-necked gowns and impeccable white gloves that define the very concept of royal chic. However, when we strip away the layers of palace-authorized biography, a far more complex and restless energy emerges from the shadows. The girl from Philadelphia who became a Hollywood icon and then a European princess was a woman of profound contradictions. A person who spent her entire life trying to satisfy the demands of others, while her own heart remained in uncharted territory. The tragic irony of her fame is that the world fell in love with a mask, while the woman behind it was frequently struggling with the chilling isolation of her own success. The final revelation of her story is not found in the grand halls of the palace or the red carpets of Cannes, but in the quiet, humanizing realization that she never truly stopped looking for an escape. Throughout her decades in Monaco, she maintained a watchful presence over her own image, yet she often dropped hints to those she trusted that her greatest role was one she had been forced to accept. She was a woman of deep, hidden passions who had been convinced to trade her creative fire for the stability of a throne. The sensory details of her legacy are found in the objects she left behind: the dried petals of a rose from a garden she tended with her own hands, the sound of her voice on rare, candid recordings, and the hollow silence of the rooms she once occupied. As we look back at the Ice Queen, we see that the coolness she projected was a survival mechanism, a way to protect the vulnerable core of a woman who had been deeply hurt by the rejection of her first true love. The story of the unsent letter and her late-night confessions suggests that she died with a heart that was still partially anchored in the United States, reaching for a version of herself that existed before the world demanded she be perfect. She was a mother, a philanthropist, and a sovereign, but she was also a romantic exile who understood the heavy price of a fairy tale ending. The ultimate lesson of Grace Kelly's life is that even the most beautiful cage is still a cage. She lived a life of extraordinary influence and luxury, yet she was haunted by the what-ifs of a life she was never allowed to lead. Her death was a shock to the global system, but for Grace, it was the final conclusion to a narrative she had long since ceased to control. We remember her now not just as a princess, but as a woman who reminds us that the heart has its own reasons which reason and royalty cannot always understand. She remains a legend of the Golden Age, a figure of eternal elegance whose greatest mystery was the simple, heartbreaking desire to be known for who she was rather than what she represented. Grace Kelly didn't just leave behind a principality, she left behind a mystery of the heart. In the end, the most iconic woman in the world was just a girl from Philadelphia who never stopped looking for the exit. If you found this deep dive into the hidden heart of the Princess of Monaco compelling, we invite you to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more exclusive Hollywood lore, where we continue to peel back the velvet curtains on the icons you thought you knew. Thank you for watching.